There is a particular stillness they teach you in your first month at the gate, and it is not the stillness of a statue. A statue is empty. The stillness they teach you is full. It is a held breath that never ends, 1,000 small decisions made and unmade behind a face that will not move. And on the morning I am about to tell you of, I held it the way I had held it 10,000 times before, and it nearly broke me to keep holding it. People who watched the footage afterward said I looked carved from stone. They could not have known. Behind that face I was a man wrestling with the heaviest thing I have ever carried, and the only weapon I had against it was the discipline of standing perfectly, terribly still. I had stood that post for 9 years by then. My name is Aldous Frey, and I was a sergeant of the household guard of the House of Vauquelin, which is to say I belonged to the men in the tall black bearskins and the red wool tunics who stand at the gates and the gilded rails, and, on certain solemn days, inside the cold gray hall of the cathedral of St. Havard. I had buried 2 kings in that cathedral. I had stood through coronations and weddings, and the long, droning state funerals of men whose names I had already forgotten. I knew the cathedral the way a sailor knows a ship, by the way sound moved through it, by the slow march of light across its floor as the morning climbed, by the cold that came up through the soles of your boots from the old stone, no matter the season. And of all the days they posted us there, the one I dreaded and waited for in equal measure was the remembrance of the Cinder March. You may not know what the Cinder March was. That, in a way, is the whole of my story, so let me tell you plainly. 2 generations before that morning, the kingdom had fought a war it later wished it had not, in a wet and ruined country to the south called the Saldonais. It was a war of bad maps and worse orders, of a campaign that should have lasted a season and lasted 3 years, and at the end of it the army that survived was made to walk out. They walked out through the marshes in the cold, the wounded carried on the backs of the unwounded, the dying laid in the carts until the carts broke, and then carried too, mile after mile, with no food worth the name and the enemy on the flanks. They called it the Cinder March because the men burned what they could not carry and walked on through the ash of their own fires, and because so many of them turned to cinders in the cold and were left where they fell with a coat over the face and nothing more. Of the army that went into the Saldonais, fewer than 1 man in 4 walked out of the marshes. The nation did not like to look at it. A war you win, you build statues to. A war you lose this way, you fold up and put in a drawer and try not to open. My father walked into the Saldonais. He did not walk out. I never knew him. I was an infant when he marched south, and the only things I have of him are a photograph gone brown at the edges, a single folded letter that reached my mother a year after his death, and a story my mother told me so many times that I cannot now tell which parts I remember and which parts I only remember being told. The story was this, that my father, dying of fever and his wounds in the worst stretch of the march, in the cold where men were laid down and left, was not left. That a soldier from another regiment, a big quiet man the others called by a single short name, came back for him when there was no reason to come back, and carried him on his shoulders for 2 days through the ash. And when my father died in the night, that soldier took the letter from inside his coat. The letter my father had written to my mother and to me, the son he had never held, and carried it out of the marshes himself, against every sense and every order, and saw that it reached us. That is how my mother knew where and how my father had died. That is how I came to have a letter in my father's hand telling me, a child he would never meet, to be a good man and to stand straight, and to remember that the smallest kindness in the coldest place is worth more than any medal a king can pin to your chest. The soldier who carried him, my mother could never name. He had given her only the short name the men used. She prayed for him every night of her life by that name and never found him, and she went to her grave not knowing whether the man who saved her husband's last words had himself come out of the marshes alive. I tell you all this now because on the morning I am describing, I did not yet know that the answer to my mother's prayer was about to walk through the west doors of the cathedral on 2 failing legs, carrying a parcel wrapped in oilcloth, and that a man in a fine coat was about to order me to throw him into the street. The remembrance was always a small ceremony made to look large. There were perhaps 200 chairs set out under the great cold vault, and a long aisle of red carpet, and at the far end, before the high altar, a plain block of dark stone they called the soldier's stone, where the survivors and the families would come, one at a time across the long mourning, to lay a flower or a token and bow their heads. The king of the house of Vauquelin would sit in the carved chair to the right of the stone, and the queen beside him, and behind them the ranks of the household and the court. And we, 6 of us that year, would be posted at the points of the floor in our red and black, motionless, our rifles grounded, our eyes forward, the living frame around the dead. I was posted nearest the soldier's stone on the left of the aisle, 3 paces from where the survivors would lay their tokens. It was, in the cold arithmetic of the guard, the best post and the worst. The best, because from there a man saw everything. The worst, for the same reason. I had asked for it every year since I learned, in my 2nd year of service, what the cinder march had taken from me. I would stand 3 paces from the stone where I imagined, against all reason, my father's name might somehow be, and I would hold my stillness, and I would let no one see that the man in the bearskin was the orphaned son of a soldier the nation preferred to forget. The post was my private cathedral inside the public one. I do not think any officer ever knew why I wanted it. I never told them. A guard's grief is his own. He does not bring it onto the floor. That is the discipline. The trouble began with the new master of the household. His name was Sir Reynold Carse, and he had held the office a little under a year. I should be careful here to be fair to a man I came to despise, because contempt is easy and the truth is better. Carse was not a fool. He was clever in the way that ambitious men are clever, quick to read a room for who mattered and who did not, quicker still to be seen beside the ones who mattered. He had come up through the great old offices on the strength of a name. The Carse name was an old one in the court, and his grandfather had been Lord Chamberlain in the very years of the Saldonais War, and he wore his new office the way a man wears a coat a size too grand, conscious of it, forever adjusting it, forever checking that others had noticed. He had a habit of touching the chain of his office when he spoke, as if to remind himself it was there. And he had decided in his 1st year that the remembrance was shabby. He had said so. I was told in the planning meetings that it was a tired, gray little affair, that the survivors who came were an embarrassment of stained coats and shaking hands, that the whole thing should be modernized, made dignified, made fit for the cameras that now came each year. He had ordered new carpet. He had ordered the chairs straightened to the inch. He had stationed his own men, ushers in dark suits with earpieces, along the aisle to keep things, as he put it, orderly. He did not understand, or he understood and did not care, that the stained coats and the shaking hands were the entire point, that the dignity of the remembrance was not in the carpet, it was in the men. There were not many of them left by then. 2 generations is a long time. Each year the line of survivors who came to the stone was shorter and slower, and each year I watched it and felt the years closing like water over a stone dropped in a pond. That year I counted 11. 11 men, the youngest of them past 80, who had been boys in the Saldonais and had walked out through the cinders and were still, somehow, walking. They came in their old coats with their old medals, those who had medals pinned crooked over their hearts, helped along by daughters and grandsons and, in 2 cases, by nurses. And one by one across the morning they would reach the stone and lay their hand on it or set down a flower. And some of them wept and most of them did not. And all of them stood as straight as their bent old bodies would let them, because they had been soldiers, and you do not stop being a soldier, and then they would turn and go back to their chairs, and the next would come. It was the most solemn thing I knew. I would have stood that post for nothing. I would have paid to stand it. Holly's Pike came last in the line, and he came alone. I noticed him before he reached the front, the way you notice a different weather coming. He was very old, even among the old. I would learn later he was 91 and very tall, or had been. He was stooped now into a question mark of a man, and he walked with 2 canes, planting them and then bringing his feet up to meet them. a slow and deliberate progress that took the patience of a saint to watch, and that he made without the smallest sign of hurry or shame. He wore a coat that had been good once and was now simply old, brushed clean but worn through at the cuffs, and over his heart there were no medals at all, only a few small holes in the wool where medals had once been pinned and were not now. And he carried, cradled in one arm against his chest with a care that you do not give to a thing you are merely holding, a long parcel wrapped in oilcloth and tied with twine, perhaps 4 feet of it, and I knew at one glance what it was, because I am a soldier and I have carried one all my life. It was a rifle, an old service rifle, wrapped against the weather, brought to the stone the way another man might bring a flower. The ushers in their dark suits did not like it. I saw them gather at the back as he came in, Cars's men, 3 of them, and I saw one murmur into his sleeve, and I saw the shape of the next 10 minutes before it happened, the way you see a glass go off the edge of a table and cannot reach it in time. A shabby old man, alone, no daughter, no grandson, no nurse, walking the long aisle at the pace of a tortoise, carrying what was unmistakably a firearm into a cathedral full of the king and the court and the cameras. To Cars's men he was a problem. To me he was the most dignified thing I had seen all morning, and I would have laid down my life for the privilege of letting him reach the stone. He was perhaps halfway up the aisle when Cars himself appeared. I had not seen him come, he had a way of arriving. One moment the aisle held only the old man and his slow canes and the murmur of the seated crowd, and the next there was Cars, stepping out from the side with his chain catching the cold light, his hand already raised in the small, smooth gesture of a man accustomed to being obeyed. He did not raise his voice. That is worth saying. He never, in all of it, raised his voice. He had the trick that powerful men have of being cruel in a murmur, so that the cruelty seems reasonable, seems like merely the management of a difficulty, and you have to have been on the receiving end of it to feel the blade inside the calm. "Sir," he said to the old man, "I'm afraid you can't bring that in here." Holly's pike stopped. He looked up. It cost him something to look up with his stoop, and he looked at Cars for a long moment with eyes that were pale and watering with age and entirely steady, and he said, in a voice like dry paper, "I've brought it every year, son." "Not while I have the running of this," Cars said, still pleasant, still murmuring. "There are protocols now, you understand. We can't have weapons on the floor." He half turned to one of his ushers and made the small gesture again, the gesture that meant deal with this. "These men will help you to the back. You can pay your respects from there. There's a lovely view from the back." I want you to understand what was being done, because Carr said it so smoothly that half the room did not understand at all, and thought perhaps that a kindly official was helping a confused old man. What was being done was this. A soldier of the Cinder March, one of the last 11 men alive who had walked out of the marshes, had come to lay his own rifle, the rifle he had carried out, I would learn, on a back that had carried more than rifles through that cold, at the stone raised to his dead. And he was being turned away from the stone, in front of the king, by the grandson of the man who had sent him into the Saldanha, and told there was a lovely view from the back. The old man did not move toward the back. He stood where he was, planted on his 2 canes, the parcel against his chest, and he said very quietly, so quietly that I think only I and Cars and the nearest usher heard it, "I walked 400 miles to put this down. I expect I can walk the last 40 feet. And then Cars made his mistake. He turned to me. You must understand the geography of what happened, because everything turned on it. I was the nearest guard to the stone and to the aisle. Cars's ushers were his own men, but they were not soldiers, and there is a thing that happens in a room like that, a deference, where a man in a fine coat reaching the limit of his usher's usefulness will look around for a uniform, for the genuine article, for the figure in the bearskin who is the actual hard edge of the state. He looked around for it and he found me, 3 paces off, motionless, eyes forward, and he came to me. And he stood close enough that I could smell the cologne on him over the cold stone, and he said, low and reasonable, "Sergeant, move this gentleman to the rear. Now." I did not move. This is the part the footage shows. There is a clip of it that, I am told, a great many people have now seen, though I have never been able to make myself watch it. It shows a guardsman in red and black, rifle grounded, eyes forward, perfectly still, and a man in a chain of office standing close at his shoulder, speaking, and the guardsman not moving at all. It looks on the footage like nothing is happening. I promise you that more was happening inside me in those moments than in the rest of my 9 years on that floor combined. Here is what was happening. A guard does not act on the orders of the master of the household. He acts on the orders of his own officers, through his own chain, on the standing instructions of his post. Those instructions did not include removing mourners from the remembrance. Quite the reverse. Our entire purpose on that floor was to honor the men who came to the stone, and there is no version of that purpose that includes laying hands on one of them to drag him to the back of the room because a courtier finds him untidy. By every rule that governed me, I was right to stand still. Standing still was the correct and disciplined thing, and I knew it, and it should have settled the matter. It did not settle the matter because of the parcel, because I had seen the shape of the rifle under the oilcloth, and the way the old man held it, and the holes in his coat where medals had been and were not, and because somewhere under the discipline a small voice that I had kept quiet for 30 years had begun to speak, and what it said was, "You know who this is. You have always known you would meet him. This is the day." I want to be honest about how unreasonable that thought was. There were, in our history, hundreds of thousands of soldiers, and tens of thousands who survived the Cinder March, and no reason at all on earth why this particular old man with this particular rifle should be the one who carried my father 2 days through the cold. It was the thought of a child, the orphan's hope that finds the lost parent in every stranger's face. I knew that. I told myself that, standing there. And still the thought would not be quiet, because of one thing I had not let myself fully see until that moment, the way he carried the rifle. He did not carry it like a relic or a trophy. He carried it the way you carry something living that you are afraid to wake. He carried it the way my mother had described the soldier carrying my father, close and high, and with the whole body bent around the burden to keep it from the cold. I had been told that picture 1,000 times as a child. I had it in me like a second heartbeat. And here, 60 years on, was an old man crossing a cathedral floor in exactly that attitude, and I could not unsee it. Carr spoke again. "Sergeant, I gave you an instruction." I held still, the held breath that does not end, eyes forward on the cold gray air above the heads of the seated crowd. I could see, at the edge of my vision, the king in his carved chair, leaning slightly forward now, having marked that something was wrong on his floor. I could see the cameras, which Kars had wanted, swinging slowly toward us. I could see the old man, Holly's pike, still planted on his canes in the middle of the aisle, not retreating, not advancing, simply enduring, the way I imagine he had endured the marshes, by the simple refusal to fall down. "Do you know who I am?" Kars said, not loudly. A murmur again, but with the first edge in it now. "Do you understand the position you're in? I am the master of the household. I am giving you a lawful instruction in front of the king. You will take that man and that weapon to the rear of this cathedral, or I will have your bearskin and your stripes by this afternoon, and you will spend the rest of your life regretting that you chose a vagrant over your career. Do you hear me, Sergeant?" I heard him. I wanted on the record that I heard every word, because what I did with my eyes open, knowing the cost. He had named the cost precisely. My career. The post I loved. The red and black I had given my adult life to. He could take it. He was probably right that he could take it by the afternoon. I had no illusions that the rules would protect me, because the rules, as he had so kindly reminded me, gave a master of the household a great deal of room and gave a sergeant almost none, and a man like Kars knew exactly how much room he had and used all of it. I stood there and I weighed my career against an old man's last 40 feet, and I will tell you that it was not the easy choice the footage makes it look. I loved that post. I had nothing else. The guard had been my family since my mother died, and the post at the stone had been the nearest thing I had to a grave to visit. He was asking me to spend all of it, and he was right that I could not get it back. And then the old man, who could not have heard most of it, who must only have seen the courtier leaning at the guardsman's shoulder and the guardsman not moving, did a thing that decided everything. He began, slowly, with great difficulty, to kneel. He could not get all the way down. His body would not let him. But he got one cane planted and then bent the other knee toward the red carpet, lowering himself by inches, the oilcloth parcel held out before him now in both shaking hands, meaning anyone could see he meant to lay it on the carpet there in the middle of the aisle, since they would not let him reach the stone, and to do his honoring from there on the floor on his knees in front of all of them. He was going to put it down where he stood and bow his old head to the dead from the middle of the aisle like a man at prayer, because that was as close as the powerful would let him get, and 40 feet was apparently more than they could spare him. And Karst, exasperated now, his patience finally gone, stepped forward and put his foot against the parcel and pushed it, not hard, not a kick exactly, but a shove of the polished shoe, so that it slid off the old man's trembling hands and onto the carpet, and the old man, reaching after it, overbalanced, and went down onto his hip on the cathedral floor, and one of his canes clattered away across the stone, and the sound of it rang up into the great cold vault and silenced the whole room. That was the moment. There is always a moment. You spend 9 years learning to recognize the difference between a thing you must endure and a thing you must answer, and most of the time the answer is to endure, and the discipline is in the enduring. But there is a line, and the line is not in the rule book. It is older than the rule book. It is the reason the rule book exists at all. And when a powerful man knocks one of the last soldiers of the cinder march to the floor of the cathedral raised to that march's dead, and lets him sprawl there reaching for his fallen rifle while the cameras roll, that line has been crossed, and there is no discipline on earth, none, that requires a soldier to keep standing still. I left my post. I want to be precise, because the leaving of a post is the gravest thing a guard can do, and I did not do it lightly even then. I did not run. I did not shout. I did what I had been trained to do, which was the only thing I knew how to do, and I did it with the full weight of every year of drill behind it. I came to attention, a hard, ringing snap of the boots on the stone that turned every head in the cathedral, and I shouldered my rifle, and I marched. 3 paces, a turn, and I was in the aisle, and I marched down it past the astonished Karst, my eyes forward, my pace exactly the regulation pace, neither hurried nor slow, the slow, terrible ceremonial march that says this is being done on purpose by a soldier in earnest. And I marched to where the old man lay sprawled on the carpet, and I halted, and I grounded my rifle, and then I did the thing that I think no one in that cathedral was expecting, least of all me. I knelt down to him, not the kneel of a man helping a fallen stranger up off the floor, though I did help him. I knelt the way a soldier kneels to render honors at a grave. And I picked up the oilcloth parcel from the carpet where Karst had shoved it, and I held it across my 2 upturned palms, the way you hold a fallen comrade's effects, the way the regulations say a soldier's weapon is to be presented, and I looked at the old man on the floor in front of me, into his pale, steady, watering eyes, and I said the only thing I could think to say, which was not in any rule book either. "Let me carry it, sir. You've carried it long enough." And Holly's Pike looked back at me, and I will tell you that I have never in my life been looked at like that before or since, and his old mouth worked, and he said, "Do I know you, son?" "No, sir," I said, "but I think you knew my father." I did not yet know if it was true. I had no right to say it. It was the orphan's hope speaking out of me at last after 30 years in the worst possible place, and if I had been wrong it would have been a terrible thing to have said. But I was not wrong. I want you to understand that the whole rest of my life turned on the next thing the old man said, and that he said it on the floor of the cathedral with his hip bruised and his cane out of reach, and the king of the house of Vauquelin already half risen from his carved chair 40 feet away. and that he said it without hesitation, the way you answer a question you have been waiting 60 years to be asked. What was his name? The old man said. I told him my father's name. And the old man closed his eyes, and 2 tears ran down into the deep folds of his ancient face, and he reached up one shaking hand and took hold of the front of my tunic, of the red wool over my heart, and he held it, and he said, I carried him 2 days. The fever took him in the night near the castle ford. He wrote you a letter. I gave it to your mother myself in the spring when I could find her. He opened his eyes and looked at me. You stand straight, he said. He told you to stand straight. I read it. I read it before I sealed it, God forgive me, because I wanted to know what a dying man says to a son he's never held. He told you to stand straight and to be kind in the cold places. And here you are. His hand tightened on my tunic. Here you are. I have stood through coronations and funerals and 2 wars worth of ceremony, and I have never come closer to breaking on a public floor than I came in that moment. I did not break. The discipline held. It was all that held, but I will not pretend my eyes were dry. I helped the old man up gently, an arm under him, the parcel still across my other palm, and I got him to his feet and put his canes back into his hands, and I stood beside him, and I turned to face the front, and I rendered him there in the middle of the aisle a full salute. The salute we give to the colors, the salute we give to the king. I gave it to Holly's Pike, soldier of the Cinder March, in front of the entire court, and I held it, and the cathedral was so silent I could hear my own glove tremble against my brow. And that is when the matter of the sable wreath came out. I have to step back and tell you about the sable wreath, because most people watching the footage did not know what it was, and it is the hinge of everything, the buried thing that the powerful had buried, and that came up out of the ground that morning like a body the river will not keep down. The sable wreath was, and is, the highest decoration the house of Vauquelin can give a soldier. There are perhaps a dozen living men who hold it. It is not given for ordinary courage. It is given for the kind of thing men do once in a generation, the kind of thing the rest of the army tells stories about for 50 years. And there had been, in the records of the Cinder March, a recommendation for the sable wreath, a recommendation written by the dying commander of a broken regiment, in his own failing hand, for a private soldier who, when the order came to abandon the wounded at the castle ford because the carts had broken and the enemy was close and the able men could carry no more, had refused the order, who had gone back into the cinders, alone, again and again, and carried out the wounded 1 and 2 at a time on his own back through 2 days of cold that killed stronger men, and who had carried out, besides the wounded, the letters and effects of the dying, everyone he could reach, so that the families would know, so that mothers and wives and children would not spend their lives wondering, as so many did, where and how their men had fallen. The recommendation named the things he had done. It named the men he had carried. And it had been signed and sent up the chain in the last weeks of the war to the office of the Lord Chamberlain, who in those years was responsible for the awarding of honors. And it had never been awarded. The recommendation had gone into the office of the Lord Chamberlain and had not come out. There had been, I would learn, a reason of a sort, the kind of reason the powerful give themselves. The Cinder March was a disgrace the nation wished to bury, and a great public honor given for valor on the Cinder March would have meant acknowledging the Cinder March, holding it up to the light, admitting how many men had been left in the cold by bad orders and worse. It was tidier to lose the recommendation. It was tidier to let the war fold up and go in the drawer, and to let the soldier who had refused to leave the wounded go home unhonored, with a few holes in his coat where the lesser medals had been pinned, and then, in his old age, sold or lost, and to let him become, in the eyes of a new master of the household 60 years on, a shabby vagrant carrying a weapon up the aisle of a cathedral. The Lord Chamberlain who buried the recommendation was named Ambrose Carse, Reynold Carse's grandfather. I did not know this on the floor that morning. I learned it in the weeks after when the thing became, against everyone's wishes including my own, a matter the whole nation argued about. But the king knew it. That is the thing I did not understand until it was happening in front of me. The king of the house of Vauquelin, who had sat in that carved chair through 40 of these remembrances since he was a boy prince, who took the history of his house and his army with a seriousness that the courtiers around him had long since let lapse, the king knew the name Holly's Pike. He had read the buried recommendation. There are kings who are figureheads and kings who are not, and ours was not. He had spent his life learning the things his court preferred to forget, and the lost sable wreath of the Cinder March was one of the things he had quietly carried for years, waiting, I think, for a chance to set it right that the careful machinery of the court would never quite allow him. I gave my salute, the cathedral held its silence, and the king rose from his chair. When a king rises, a room rises with him, and the whole court came to its feet in a rustle and a scrape of 200 chairs, not knowing why, only knowing that the king was standing and so they must stand. And the king came down from the dais, past the stone, into the aisle with the queen behind him, and he came to where I stood beside Holly's Pike with the old rifle across my palm, and he stopped, and he looked at the old man for a long moment, and then the king of the house of Vauquelin did the thing that is now, I am told, the most watched piece of footage in the history of the kingdom. He came to attention himself, an old man's attention, but unmistakable, and he saluted Holly's Pike. A king does not salute his subjects. It is not done. It overturns the order of things. In the whole history of the house, I do not think it had been done before. The king did it. He held the salute as I had held mine, and he said, in a voice pitched to carry up into the vault so that the cameras and the court and the nation would hear it, every word. Private Pike, the crown owes you a debt 60 years overdue, and a great wrong was done you by men who wore my house's chain and dishonored it. The recommendation made for you on the castle ford was true, and it was buried, and I have known it was buried, and I have waited too long to say so. By my authority and in the sight of God and these dead, I award you the sable wreath, with my own apology that you have had to live 91 years and walk 400 miles and 40 feet to receive it. He lowered his salute, and he took the old man's free hand in both of his, and he said more quietly now, but the cameras caught it, "Thank you for my soldiers. Thank you for their letters. Thank you for not leaving them in the cold." And then he turned, and he looked at Reynold Carse. I will not soon forget Carse's face in that moment, and I take no pleasure in it now, though God knows I did then. He had gone the color of the cathedral stone. He had understood, faster than the rest of the court, exactly what was happening and exactly what it meant for him. That the old man he had shoved to the floor in front of the cameras was the holder of the sable wreath. That the wrong being put right was a wrong his own grandfather had done. That the chain he was forever touching at his throat was the very chain that had buried this man's honor, and that he had, in front of the king and the nation, kicked the rifle out of the hands of the most decorated survivor of the Cinder March and called him a vagrant. There is no recovering from such a thing. He knew it. You could see him know it. The king did not shout at him either. He had that in common with Carse, the murmur, but where Carse's murmur was a blade, the king's was a sentence handed down, and it was worse for being quiet. "Sir Reynold," the king said, "you will surrender your chain of office to me now before these men on this floor. Your grandfather buried this soldier's honor to spare the crown its embarrassment, and I have spent my reign ashamed of it. You have today buried it again with your own foot in front of the whole world, and that I will not be ashamed of because the world has seen it, and the world will see what I do about it. You are dismissed from my household and from my court. The name Carse, which once held the highest offices of this house, is struck from its rolls, as you struck this man from his. Go." And Carse, with shaking hands, lifted the chain of office over his head. The chain he had touched 100 times that morning to remind himself it was his. And he gave it into the king's hands, and he turned, and he walked down the long red aisle and out the west doors of the cathedral of St. Havard, alone, the way he had wanted the old man to go, and the doors closed behind him, and that was the last any of us saw of him. I have thought a great deal in the years since about the symmetry of it, and I do not fully trust it, because life is rarely so neat, and a story that is too neat is usually a story that has been tidied. So let me be honest about the parts that were not neat. The old man's hip was hurt in the fall, and he was a long time mending, and he was never quite so steady on his canes afterward. The footage made me, for a season, a thing I never wished to be, recognized in the street, asked for by name, written about in ways that had little to do with what had actually happened on that floor, and a great deal to do with what people wished had happened. There were those, too, who said the king had staged it, that it was all arranged, a piece of theater. I can tell you it was not, that I left my post on my own and against orders and fully expecting to lose everything. But I cannot make a man believe me who would rather believe the tidy, cynical thing. And the Karst name being struck from the rolls did not give Holly's Pike back his 60 years, or my father his life, or my mother the name she had prayed by every night and never found. A wrong put right at the end is still a wrong. The sable wreath, pinned at last to the holes in the old coat where the lesser medals had been, did not unbury anyone. But here is what it did do, and it is the thing I hold on to. For the rest of his life, which was in the end not long, he died the following winter in his own bed, an old soldier at last at peace. Holly's Pike was known. The nation that had wished to forget the cinder march was made, by 60 seconds of footage from a cathedral floor, to remember it, to look at it, to take it out of the drawer and hold it up to the light. The names of the dead of the Saldonais, my father's among them, were read aloud at the next remembrance, all of them, every one, a reading that took a full day and have been read every year since. And the rifle, the old service carbine that Pike had carried out of the marshes and brought to the stone every year of his long life, was laid, at his own request, not in a museum but at the foot of the soldier's stone, where it remains, and where I have stood my post beside it every remembrance since, 3 paces off, eyes forward, the living frame around the dead. And around the one old soldier's weapon that says, to anyone who knows how to read it, a man came back into the cold for the wounded, and he was not forgotten in the end, though it was a very near thing. They kept me on, by the way. There was a question of it for a few days. I had left my post after all, which is no small thing, and there were officers who felt, rightly enough, that a guard who leaves his post for a good reason is still a guard who has learned he can leave his post. But the king let it be known that the matter was closed, and it was closed. I was glad. I did not want a medal for it, and I was not given one, and that is as it should be. I had done nothing but the thing my father told me to do in a letter carried out of the marshes on another man's back, which was to stand straight and to be kind in the cold places. I have tried to do both. I stand as straight as the years will let me, which is straighter than most, the drill having got into my bones. And I have learned from one old man on one cold morning that there are 2 kinds of stillness a guard must master, and that the harder of the 2 by far is knowing the single moment in a lifetime when the right thing, the only thing, the thing your whole discipline was built to protect, is to move. I think of my father at the castle ford, dying in the cold, and of the big quiet soldier who would not leave him, who carried him 2 days and carried his last words home. I never got to thank that soldier. I told myself I never would, that he was one of the unnamed dead, that the most I could do was stand my post and honor men like him in the abstract. And then he walked through the west doors on 2 canes with a rifle wrapped in oilcloth, 91 years old, and shoved to the floor by a man in a fine coat, and I was given the one thing I had never dared to pray for, the chance to carry his rifle the last 40 feet, and to say, on behalf of a father I never knew and a mother who prayed for him by a single short name every night of her life, thank you. The smallest kindness in the coldest place, my father wrote, is worth more than any medal a king can pin to your chest. He was right. But I will tell you, having now seen a king come down off his dais to pin one with his own hands on an old soldier 60 years too late, that it is a fine thing when the kindness and the medal arrive together, on the same cold morning, in the same gray light, on the floor of the same cathedral, and that a man is lucky beyond all deserving who gets to stand, in his red and black, at the exact place, and the exact hour where a very old wrong is finally, quietly, set right. I stood there. I will stand there as long as they let me. And when my own legs fail, as his did, I hope someone will carry whatever I leave behind the last 40 feet and lay it down, and not leave it in the cold.